At the dawn of 1914, Europe, like a sleeping giant, awoke to a nightmare. Peace, fragile and illusory, vanished like the morning mist over the fields of East Prussia, revealing the harsh reality of a continent on the brink of an abyss. The distant sound of cannons, an almost inaudible murmur at first, gradually transformed into a thunder that announced the impending storm. It was the prelude to Tannenberg, a name that would soon echo with the lament of thousands of lives cut short, an epitaph for lost innocence. In that scenario of apprehension, two men, separated by a generation, but united by the relentless fate of war, prepared for what was to come. Sergeant Karl Richter, in his early 30s, was an imposing figure, shaped by the harshness of rural life and the bitter experience of military maneuvers that, until then, seemed only distant exercises from the true carnage. His blue eyes, deep as winter lakes, reflected the gray landscape of Prussia, but also the shadow of a past that had taught him to distrust calm. The scar on his eyebrow, an almost invisible mark, was a silent reminder that life, even in times of peace, could be relentless. He exuded an aura of weariness, a resignation that only familiarity with adversity can bring. Karl did not speak much. His words were few and heavy, laden with wisdom gained from prolonged silences and keen observations. He saw war not as a glorious adventure, but as an inevitable burden, a grinding machine of flesh and spirit, and his only ambition was to guide his men through it with minimal losses. Beside him, young Erik Schmidt, fresh out of adolescence, was a stark contrast. At just 18, his blonde hair, almost white, and his vibrant green eyes had not yet been touched by the shadow of disillusionment. He wore the military uniform with a mixture of pride and awkwardness, his narrow shoulders seeming too small for the weight of responsibility he carried. Erik was an idealist, fueled by stories of heroism and the patriotic rhetoric that permeated the air. He dreamed of glory, of recognition, of the honor of serving his homeland. His mind, not yet stained by the brutality of reality, buzzed with the excitement of adventure, though a subtle, almost imperceptible fear nestled in his chest. He looked at Karl with a mixture of respect and admiration, seeking in the veteran confirmation that everything would be all right, that war, despite its dangers, was a path to greatness. Erik spoke with the effervescence of youth, his thoughts jumping from one topic to another, eager to learn, to prove his worth. He did not yet understand that war was not a stage for heroes, but an abyss that swallowed everyone without distinction. 1914. The air of East Prussia, dense and humid, carried the smell of wet earth and the promise of rain. The soldiers, lined up in silence, watched the horizon, where the mist clung to the trees like a shroud. The tension was palpable, a knot in every man's throat. The anticipation of imminent combat hung over them, heavier than the equipment they carried. Erik felt his heart pound in his chest, a mixture of adrenaline and dread. He gripped his rifle, his hands sweaty, while Karl beside him maintained a rigid posture, his eyes fixed on nothing, as if trying to decipher the secrets of the wind. East Prussia, with its austere beauty and history of conflicts, prepared for another chapter of blood and sacrifice. And in the mist that covered the fields, the destiny of Karl and Erik began to unfold, a destiny intertwined with that of war itself.
As Europe ignited, East Prussia, a German stronghold in the east, found itself threatened by an unexpected and swift Russian advance. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's great gamble for a quick victory in the West had underestimated Russia's mobilization capability. Now 2 Russian armies, the first under Paul von Rennenkampf and the second led by Alexander Samsonov, converged on the province, like the pincers of a giant crab, threatening to crush the numerically inferior German 8th Army. The news of General von Prittwitz's removal, deemed hesitant, and the arrival of Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff to take command, brought a new, albeit tense, hope. The strategy was audacious, to confront the Russian armies separately, taking advantage of the vast and impassable area of the Masurian lakes that divided them. For Karl and Erik, strategy was a distant abstraction, a murmur from the higher echelons. The reality was the incessant march, the mud that clung to their boots and weighed down every step, the biting cold that penetrated layers of fabric and gnawed at their bones. Days and nights blurred into a haze of exhaustion. The smell of damp earth mingled with the acrid odor of sweat and fear. The landscape, once familiar, transformed into a hostile setting, every tree, every rise, a potential hiding place for the enemy. Erik, with his youth and vigor, felt his body protest, but his mind, still resilient, tried to find some meaning in it all. He watched Karl, who seemed immune to fatigue, his steps firm and rhythmic, as if the ground beneath his feet were an extension of his own will. The sergeant, in turn, noticed the growing pallor on the recruit's face, the way his eyes, once so full of life, began to dim, replaced by a constant vigilance and a shadow of apprehension. Rumors spread like wildfire, sightings of Russian patrols, distant sounds of gunfire, the ever-closer proximity of confrontation. Anxiety was a parasite that fed on silence and darkness. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves was a potential enemy. The men slept little, and when they did, their dreams were populated by nightmares. Camaraderie, once a comfort, became a vital necessity, a fragile bond that held them together in the face of uncertainty. Erik, in a moment of weakness, asked Karl if he thought they would return home. Karl, without averting his gaze from the horizon, replied that the only certainty in war was uncertainty, but that they would fight to the last man. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of truths that Erik could not yet comprehend. The march continued, and with each step, East Prussia pulled them further into the heart of a battle that would forever change the course of their lives and the face of history.
The silence of dawn was abruptly torn apart by a deafening roar. Russian artillery, like an awakened dragon, spewed fire and steel upon the German positions. The ground trembled, the air filled with shrapnel and the metallic smell of burnt gunpowder. Erik, thrown to the ground by the force of the explosion, felt the impact of reality. There was no glory, only visceral terror. His ears rang, his vision blurred by dust and smoke. Beside him, Karl, with surprising agility for his age, was already on his feet, shouting orders that were lost in the pandemonium. The battle had begun, and with it, Erik's innocence began to shatter. The battlefield transformed into an inferno. Screams of pain, the dry crack of rifles, the cries of the wounded. Erik, rifle in hand, fired instinctively, his body on autopilot, his mind struggling to process the chaos. He saw a comrade fall, his body inert in the mud, his eyes fixed on the gray sky. Death, once a distant abstraction, became a palpable presence, a specter dancing among the trenches. Karl, with the experience of one who had faced death many times, moved with calculated precision, his eyes sweeping the terrain, identifying threats, protecting his men. He tried to keep Erik close, a protective instinct that war, paradoxically, intensified. But battle made no distinction. It devoured everyone, young and old, experienced and inexperienced. Hours dragged on, each minute an eternity. Hunger and thirst were forgotten, replaced by adrenaline and fear.
The mud, once just an annoyance, was now a sticky blanket that covered everything, mixing with blood and earth. The men's faces, once distinct, were now masks of dirt and exhaustion. Dehumanization was a subtle but relentless process. With each shot, each life cut short, a part of humanity was lost. Erik felt the weight of the weapon in his hands, the smell of blood in his nostrils, and with each moment, the image of the hero he dreamed of being crumbled, revealing the figure of a frightened young man fighting to survive. Karl watched Erik's transformation, the way the light in his eyes diminished, the line of his mouth hardened. He knew that war not only killed bodies, but also souls, and that the true battle was against the despair that threatened to consume everyone. First blood had been shed, and with it the promise that many more would come, in a macabre dance of life and death that would spare no one.
The Battle of Tannenberg reached its peak, transforming East Prussia into a cauldron of fire and steel. The German tactic of encircling the Russian Second Army, taking advantage of the communication failure between enemy forces, began to materialize. The sound of artillery was incessant, a hammer pounding on the sanity of men. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, churned earth, and the nauseating sweetness of blood. The fighting was hand-to-hand in many places, a macabre dance of bayonets and screams, where survival was a matter of milliseconds and pure luck. Karl, with his experience, moved with brutal efficiency, his movements precise and economical. He saw in the eyes of the recruits the same terror he himself had felt in his first battles, but now fear was a constant companion, not an enemy to be fought. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak that enveloped him, every muscle aching, every breath an effort. He ate cold rations and slept in short shifts, with his rifle by his side, always alert. War for him was no longer about victories or defeats, but about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of annihilation. He saw himself and his men as pieces on a giant chessboard, moved by invisible forces, and the only thing they could control was how they faced the inevitable. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and gunpowder, a harbinger of the final storm. The German offensive, a relentless hammer, advanced over the Russian lines, now disorganized and exhausted. The cry of "Vorwärts" echoed across the fields, mingling with the roar of cannons and the crackle of machine guns. Karl, at the head of his men, felt adrenaline pump through his veins, a last surge of energy before collapse. His eyes, once tired, gleamed with a feverish intensity, the determination of a veteran who knew that this was the end of the line, for better or worse. He did not think of victory, only of fulfilling his duty, of leading his men as far as possible, even if it meant the ultimate sacrifice. Erik, beside him, moved like an automaton, his body responding to the commands of a mind that was already on the verge of exhaustion. Fear, once a shiver down his spine, had transformed into a cold acceptance, a resignation to the inevitable. He saw Karl's face, marked by dirt and fatigue, yet still a beacon of strength amidst the chaos. In a moment of lucidity, Erik thought of his home, the smell of his mother's freshly baked bread, his sister's laughter. The irony of the situation was cruel. He had dreamed of glory, but found only brutality. And now death awaited him in a field of mud and blood, thousands of kilometers from home. A blinding flash, followed by a deafening roar, swallowed the landscape. An artillery shell, a harbinger of death, directly hit Karl and Erik's position. The impact was overwhelming, an invisible force that threw them high into the air like ragdolls. The world spun, sound distorted, and a searing pain shot through their bodies. Karl, in his last moments, saw the sky of East Prussia, a pale and indifferent blue, and thought of the futility of it all. Erik, with wide eyes, felt the cold earth on his face, the smell of iron and death. Life drained away, and with it,
dreams of glory and stolen innocence. Both the veteran and the recruit, the skeptic and the idealist, perished together, their bodies mingling with the mud and history, another statistic in a conflict that made no distinction. The silence that followed the explosion was more terrifying than the battle's noise itself. A macabre calm hung over the field, now a scene of devastation. Bodies lay scattered, like dry leaves after a storm. The smell of death was suffocating, a poignant reminder of the cost of victory. The Battle of Tannenberg was over. A decisive victory for Germany, but at what cost? Glory was an empty word, a distant echo amidst the ruins. Only the mud, silent witness to so much pain and sacrifice, remained, absorbing blood and tears, forever guarding the secrets of those who perished there. The final irony was that in victory, humanity had lost more than it gained, and war, the true villain, continued its relentless harvest.
The fields of East Prussia, once the stage for one of the most decisive battles of World War I, fell silent. The Battle of Tannenberg, a military triumph for Germany, left behind not only a trail of destruction and bodies, but also a persistent echo of pain and reflection. The victory, celebrated with fervor in Berlin, was, for those who lived it and for the families who lost their loved ones, a grim reminder of the futility of glory in the face of human loss. Karl and Erik, the veteran and the recruit, became part of this echo. Their lives, their fears, and their sacrifices intertwined in the tapestry of history. The memory of war is often romanticized, adorned with acts of heroism and sacrifice. But the reality of Tannenberg, like that of so many other battles, was mud, cold, hunger, constant terror, and gradual dehumanization. The fragility of the Russian army, exposed so brutally, was just a symptom of a larger disease that afflicted all involved, war itself. It chose no sides, distinguished not between just and unjust, it simply consumed, leaving behind only scars and the bitter lesson that violence, however justified it may seem, always exacts an incalculable price. The legacy of Tannenberg does not reside only in history books or military strategies. It echoes in untold stories, in the whispers of survivors, in the nightmares of those who returned, and in the eternal absence of those who remained. The German victory, though strategically important, did not bring lasting peace, but only sowed the seeds for future conflicts. The futility of glory, the ephemerality of life, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity are the true lessons that emerge from the mist of East Prussia. May the story of Karl and Erik, and that of so many others who perished in the shadow of Tannenberg, serve not as a monument to war, but as an invitation to reflection. May the echo of their sacrifices remind us of the importance of peace, the fragility of life, and the need to seek understanding instead of conflict. For in the end, the greatest victory is not that of one army over another, but that of humanity over its own capacity for destruction. May the mud of Tannenberg, which absorbed so much blood and so many tears, teach us to value every moment of peace, every gesture of compassion, and to fight not against each other, but for the construction of a world where war is just a distant memory, an echo that reminds us of what we must never repeat.